This is Traceability Insider Podcast. This week, we are unraveling the United Nations Traceability Protocol. Is it truly the apex of traceability protocols that exists? We'll be exploring the role of UNTP in global transparency revolution in supply chains. We discuss all of this and much more on today's episode. Today, I am joined by Steve Capel, who is a member of the Australian delegation for UNCFACT. He has been contributing to digital standards for trade facilitation for around 20 years. In that capacity, he's currently working on a recommendation to nations on the implementation of supply chains transparency at scale. This project includes some detailed implementation guidance in the form of UN Transparency Protocol. UNTP is an open standard that provides practical solutions to challenges like due diligence, corporate scope, disclosures, mass balance, greenwashing, data privacy, paper compatibility, and commercial incentives. UNTP is designed for scalability and allows every value chain actor to take simple steps towards a value-based participation in transparent and sustainable supply chains without any dependency on other actors in the value chain. When not working on UNCFACT projects, Steve runs a boutique consultancy in Canberra, Australia that provides digital strategy and implementation services to Australian government agencies, including the Australian Border Force, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, and the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. Hello, Steve. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join your podcast.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit about you and UNTP?
Sure. Well, I'm Australian-based, but the UNTP is a project being run by the United Nations Center for E-commerce and Trade Facilitation. It's called UNCFACT. And it's actually, it's a global body that sets standards for trade facilitation, but it's managed by a secretariat at one of the UN's 5 regional commissions. There are 5 of them, and this one is managed in the European Economic Commission. But it serves the global community. So most of the work at UNCFACT is done by a global community of volunteers who join as experts through their country head of delegation. So I'm a Australian delegate expert to the United Nations around trade facilitation and e-commerce, and more recently, sustainability. So that's me. UNCFACT, if you want a quick background, because most people never heard of it, has been around, not always with the same name, but since around 1950 or 60, just after the war, Great War. And its focus has been to streamline and facilitate trade through the use of standards. So it's really much a standards focus, right? Not a policy focus. It's Since 1960s, it's produced a whole series of recommendations, starting at number 1. And number 1 actually is an interesting one in a way, because it was a recommendation called the UN Layout Key, which was basically how to shape paper documents. Sounds a bit archaic, but actually it's probably one of the most impactful ones, because if you've ever looked at an airway bill, they all look the same. Right? And the reason they look the same is because of UNEC recommendation number 1 in 1970, I think it was. It was issued. Yeah. And then there's a whole bunch more recommendations around, location codes and data exchange standards. And you can roll the clock forward all the way to current draft recommendation number 49, which is called Transparency at Scale. And the challenge it's trying to overcome is joining all the islands of information to be able to construct a global traceability and transparency picture. That's the purpose of recommendation 49. And that's the policy recommendation, but with it is a more technical specification called the UNTP, United Nations Transparency Protocol. That's the thing I think we're going to talk about mostly today. But yeah, that's the background.
So back in 2018, when I started learning about the sustainable practices that the world was trying to take, especially starting from the EU Commission and other standardized bodies, we were We learned about the digital product passports, the battery passports, and so many other things that were trying to really address the issues that were arising at that time. But recently, when I started working in mining, that's when I realized there's so many standards, so many platforms, and everyone was working independently. But when I visited UNTP, I was like, probably this is the right solution for this. But according to you, do you think UNTP is the apex for this type of solutions? Is it really solving the issues?
Well, that is one of its two primary intents, right? To solve that interoperability issue. That's true. It's a voluntary standard, and some UN standards get very widely adopted and become enormously successful, and some don't. So it's too early to project a successful future, but of course, we're expecting that it will answer these interoperability questions for sure.
Yeah, but why was UNTP introduced? What are the problems they're trying to address?
Well, primarily, it's a response to greenwashing, right? So greenwashing, as your listeners may understand, is the deliberately fraudulent or deliberately misleading claims made about products with regard to their sustainability characteristics. So you paint something greener than it really is. That's what greenwashing is, right? A small example, I went to a clothes shop the other day, I won't name which one, and there was a nice label on the jacket that I did end up buying it, in fact, but it had a nice label on it with a recycling logo, and it said 100% recycled, right? And you go, oh, that's interesting. But then when you look closely at the label, it said, presented to you in 100% recycled packaging, right? That's the fine print. So in my view, that's an example of greenwashing, right? Because the impression you first get is that you're buying a recycled product, but actually you're just buying it in a recycled paper bag, right? So it's not the same thing. Yeah. And so that's an example. There are a number of surveys out there done by the European Commission, done by several other nations that indicate greenwashing is around 60 to 70% of all claims are made about all products have some kind of greenwashing angle, it means it's a really serious problem, right? Because if you're trying to promote a world order, if you like, where people value more sustainable products and hopefully are willing to pay a little bit more for more sustainable products, then if the sustainability claims are essentially bullshit, then the value is reduced, right? It's a vicious circle, a kind of what I call a race to the bottom. If you don't believe the claims, you won't pay the premium. Therefore, there's no premium for legitimate manufacturers to justify their investment, and the whole thing collapses, right? So what we really want to do is shine sunlight on the global value chains and all the claims made therein, so that it's harder to hide sustainable and non-sustainable behavior, so that the claims are more trustworthy and the value goes up, right? That's basically the heart of UNTP. Yeah. Then you get into the question, all right, how do I shine this sunlight? Where is the data that I'm shining sunlight on, right? And you realize very quickly that it's very, very distributed. And pretty much every finished product that you buy started its life from materials that either dug out of the ground or grown on top of the ground, right? Pretty much, maybe fished out of the sea. But so those are long and complex international value chains. And if you care about, for example, I don't know, the fair work practices around the cobalt that's in the materials in the electric vehicle you buy in, let's say, in Europe, it's a long way back to the cobalt mine, right? Through all those steps, and what we discovered is that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of let's call them technology solutions. Some blockchain, some not, and pretty much in the early days, they all had a similar vision, which was we'll adopt all the actors in a supply chain onto our platform, and we'll draw a picture then from basically from cradle to grave. Right? It's a nice idea, but if you think about it for a moment, it's very similar to saying, I'm sitting in Australia and I can call you in Rwanda as long as you have a telephone with Australian Telecom. And you go, well, that's not going to work because you're in Rwanda. I don't know who the telecom providers are, but they're not Australian, that's for sure. You use your phone with your network. I use my phone with mine, but we can still call each other. Why? Because of telephone routing, right? It's very similar with banking. You choose a bank, I choose a bank. I can make a payment. The reason the payment works is because of an interoperability standard called SWIFT, right? So basically the intent is that UNTP is to global transparency data what SWIFT is to interbank transfers, right? So it's a standard or a protocol, not a technology solution, but it's one that's designed to help technology solutions exchange their data across long and complex value chains, right? And fortunately, my experience is interesting, is that a few years ago, if you ask some of the big vendors, solution providers, I should say, in the traceability space, they all had this mindset of everyone will use my platform. But now I would say almost exclusively all of them are saying, actually, I have a certain number of customers, but I'm never going to dominate the world. And I actually have to deliver, the way for me to deliver more value to my customers is to allow them to reach beyond the boundaries of my platform, right? So that they can exchange data with others. So that's basically the business rationale if you're a software solution vendor to adopt UNTP. It basically connects you and your customers to the global world, right? So that's what it's for.
As a normal citizen, when they tell me, when I want to sell something and they tell me there's a system that has to go through it, it's clear to me it's a system. But now UNTP is a protocol. What does that mean? What does that mean to the clients, to the world?
Yeah, I think to the average citizen, they won't know what it is and don't need to know what it is. In a very similar way, you pick up your phone and make a phone call. You don't need to know the technical protocols that connect you to me, or that SWIFT international banking is based on SWIFT, right? The impact on the user is, or the normal person, is the increased visibility that they have and the increased confidence in the accuracy of the claims made, right? But the actual implementers of UNTP will typically, at one level, be software providers, right? Typically enterprise software, business software, whatever a business is already using will need to start issuing and receiving digital product passports in the same way that it issues and receives invoices and purchase orders, right? It's kind of like another business transaction. And this is a standard for digital product passports and related bits of information that carry the sustainability data, right? So, yeah, if it's successful, it'll be one of those things nobody's ever heard of, but everybody sees it working. Yeah.
So what is the current stand of UNTP in global trade? What is the level of adoption on a global basis?
Well, it's very early, right? So UNTP itself is not yet a finished specification. It will be at version 1.0 ready for large-scale implementation early next calendar year, around January, February. Between now and then, we're just approaching a milestone of probably version 0.5, in which we will do some pilots with various actors around the world in probably 3 sectors. One will be agriculture and food, and Australian agriculture is participating in that already. Another one will be textiles and leather, probably driven by the big brands in Europe. And another one will be mining and critical minerals. And the attempt generally is to, or the value proposition is to focus more on the upstream side of the value chain, because I think, as some of your listeners will know, there are already things like the global battery alliance making a product passport and so on. They tend to be the characteristics, I would say, of most battery digital product passport initiatives is that they tend to be siloed in a particular sector. So they're about batteries or they're about packaging, and those silos don't talk to each other. But they also tend to be very downstream focused, finished product focused, not so much upstream focused. And so UNTP is aiming to focus on the upstream parts of the value chain as, imagine it like a feedstock of data that informs the downstream digital product passports. Because, for example, your listeners may know that the European Union is about to implement some regulation around digital product passports that will require products sold into the European market to be accompanied by a digital product passport. So you'll be able to scan a QR code and have a look at the sustainability characteristics. But if you think about it, like many economies, more than half of the products sold into Europe with a digital product passport will not be made in Europe. They'll be made somewhere else, right? And so the European manufacturer or retailer or distributor or whatever role it is, has a bit of a challenge, right? Because they are legally obliged to stand by the accuracy of the data in their passport. And that's under a regulation called the due diligence regulation. The general regulatory approach to solve that is to force transparency onto corporates and then make legal penalties or compliance penalties for fake news, right? So that transparency happens at two different levels. Many countries around the world are imposing sustainability disclosures at the corporate level, right? So along with the annual report, many companies, including in Australia, will have to start saying, and here's my environmental footprint. But this is at the granularity of a corporate once per year, a bit like your annual report, right? Quite hard to drill down from that down to the T-shirt or the battery or the thing you make, right? So the European Union is saying, well, we're gonna force transparency not just at the corporate level but at the product level, right? So a digital product passport is basically a regulated transparency statement about the sustainable characteristics of a product, backed by penalties, right? So you can no longer make fake claims, or you can, but you might pay a fine, right? And so that's the purpose. Now, if I'm a European brand and I'm selling goods into the European market, but I'm buying the goods from overseas, then I'm in a little bit of a tricky situation, right? Because I have to stand by the accuracy of the data I put on the passport. Right? The brand or retailer in Europe is the one that will get sued if the facts are untrue. But they depend on their upstream value chain to tell them the truth. This is where the problem lies, right? How can you be sure that the data you're getting from your upstream suppliers is actually true? And this is probably the main focus point of UNTP, is to say, well, how can we accompany upstream data with upstream evidence that gives sufficient confidence in the truth of the claims, sustainability claims, as goods enter a market, right? So that's its focus.
And how does UNTP give the evidence?
Yeah, there's a few answers to that. So the heart of UNTP is a fairly simple digital product passport standard, right? That basically says this little data structure, it's not very complicated, should accompany every shipment of goods in upstream supply chain. So each distinct shipment. So for example, a shipment of copper concentrate from a Canadian mine to a Japanese manufacturer would come with a copper concentrate product passport that says, the copper was mined with fair work practices. The environmental impact has been assessed and minimized. The carbon intensity is XYZ, all that stuff. But the passport is issued by the producer or manufacturer. So basically it's an ambit claim. You put whatever you want to put in it, right? So, and there may or may not be a regulatory environment to force accuracy in the country that is issuing the passport. So what UNTP does as well is say, well, if you want your passport data to be more believable, then you should attach an independent third-party conformity credential that says some other trusted entity, could be a government, could be a certifying body, conformity assessment body, has made an assessment of your process, your plant, your facility, your inputs and outputs, and asserts to the accuracy of the data in the passport. Right? So that's basically adding confidence that the claims are true through third-party evidence. The other side of it is traceability. Traceability itself is a kind of transparency, right? So another part of UNTP is a thing called traceability events, so that, for example, if I'm, let's say, buying a electric vehicle battery, it'll have a passport issued by the manufacturer of the battery saying such and such about the battery, may have an associated conformity credentials where a third party attests to them. It may also start to provide a bill of materials. Say this battery is made of so much copper, so much lithium, so much this and that. And a traceability event is a thing that says, for this finished product, these were the material inputs. And each material input itself can have a digital product passport, which tells you about the next material inputs and so on, right? So traceability events are tools to draw this graph and start. It's like pulling on the end of a piece of string. You got a battery at the end, you pull on the string and you find the anodes and cathodes, and then you find the copper concentrate and all the way back to the mine, right? So those are the three key parts of UNTP. One of the challenges that I don't know if you're going to ask me this question, is how do you believe the auditor, right? So it's all very well to have a conformity credential from some, authorized body, but the press is full of stories where a certifier, I don't know, travels from, let's say, Europe to India to assess some sugarcane farms, and is told by the producer, go look at these 3 farms, and it doesn't mention the other 7 farms. And those farms know that you're coming. So if there's any illegal work practices, they won't be on show on the day that you're audited, right? So this challenge of how do you avoid a practice of, some people call it fake it till you make it, right? In other words, yes, we know people are looking at our practices, so we'll get a third-party certificate, but we'll make sure that the third-party inspector doesn't see what we don't want him to see. And this is more challenging, I would say, in developing nations. That's where some innovative solutions might be needed, that maybe less about third-party audits and more about peer review, keeping each other honest. Who is really incentivized in, let's say, Democratic Republic of Congo, artisanal cobalt mining? If you go through the major buyers to audit, you might find what they want you to see. But if you ask, let's say, the local township or community members to dob in or to anonymously report, or some sort of mechanism of incentives to drive better behavior, then maybe there's a solution. This is probably one of the most challenging areas, right? And one of the UNTP pilots will try to prove this in an African economy to test whether this sort of information can work. Because unfortunately, it's a difficult situation for the UN, because the UN exists. It exists for many reasons, primarily to stop World War III, really. But its a big focus, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals and the uplift, economic uplift of underdeveloped areas, right? So it's a strong focus of the UN to say, well, how can we make this work in developing countries? And because the risk is, back to that story of the European brand selling products into Europe and maybe a bit fearful of the risk of exposure. One way to mitigate that risk is to say, well, I'm only going to buy my raw materials. I'll make sure my raw materials come from developed nations that have strong labor practices, so no copper from Africa, only copper from Canada, for example, and that's one way to mitigate that risk, but it's not good for the developing nation, right? Who wants to sell their primary materials, ideally at higher prices because they are sustainable and provably so. So what we want to do is find a way to provide sufficient evidence particularly with those raw material shipments from developing nations, so that the the brands can be sufficiently confident that they've met their due diligence obligations. And this is it's a challenging area, I would say.
Are you probably involving some other actors in the field that are trying to address that? Let's say, how does UNTP probably involve other key players?
UNTP is a, if you like, it's a technical specification, right, for interoperability, coming from a part of the UN whose mandate is to develop standards. There are other parts of the UN, like UNCTAD and UN Environment Programme and so on and so forth, whose mandate is more about environmental protection or about developing economy uplift. So we collaborate with those other parts of the UN, right? So the UNEP, UN Environment Programme, is running a global, what they're calling a global digital product passport blueprint, right? So it's not inventing a new technical standard like we are, but it's assessing the impact and feasibility of digital product passports all over the world, including developing nations. So it's through relationships like that I think we hope to be able to answer these questions. It won't be UNTP directly itself answering those questions. It'll be through partnerships, right? And then, of course, there's commercial partnerships, right? Because there are organizations, and I think you had Benjamin Sinclair on a previous podcast, who runs it's a private venture, but it runs a software platform, I think, called DataStake, who's taking a different approach to that question of how do you prove the truth, right? Instead of expensive third-party auditors, it's more a community peer group model. So there could be some interesting opportunities to test things like DataStake through UNTP as a protocol, and involve organizations like UNCTAD or UNEP from a sort of policy and economic development perspective to put that lens on it, right? So it's a complex question that no one organization will answer on their own, is the short answer, all right? And we need to collaborate with respective organizations and their mandates to test the feasibility of all this.
Earlier on, you were talking about the digital product passport, that is the heart of the UNTP, followed with the digital conformity credentials and the traceability events. But I would think that would probably apply to one sector, to one standard. How does UNTP make sure that it's done at scale? For example, in mining, we have the Dodd-Frank Act standards, we have the RCM certifications, we have several key players that have different roles. How is it done on that?
Yeah, so there's actually two questions embedded in that one you just asked me, right? So there's a kind of a technical side of it, which is that we recognize that different jurisdictions have different laws, and different industry sectors have different data requirements, and it would be infeasibly complex to try to make one digital product passport that somehow meets the needs of every jurisdiction or country and every industry sector. It would be a monster, right? It'd be like War and Peace. And so we took a different approach to say, let's focus on the interoperable common core. And then let's provide an extensions architecture, if you like, or methodology, whereby a particular industry sector, perhaps in a particular country, can take UNTP and add to it the stuff they need for their industry and their jurisdiction without breaking the common core interoperability, right? And so we have some examples of that with, for example, the Australian agriculture industry sector in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture, federal government agency, taking UNTP and creating a thing called AATP, which stands for Australian Agriculture Traceability Protocol, right? So this is testing the idea that you can use the Common Core, extend it for a particular purpose, but still be interoperable, right? So the core of AATP there are three types of passports. One's called a digital livestock passport. So now we're talking about one of Australia's largest industries is shipping beef around the world, right? And So the livestock passport is just like the UNTP digital product passport, except it's got bovine characteristics, frame height, fat content, things that only apply to cows, and history of health treatments, right? Because it's important, what drugs did you inject your cow with when you're selling food, right? This is obviously completely irrelevant for batteries because you don't administer drugs to bucket loads of copper. So you can see already how there are certain things that you must have in one sector that are meaningless in another sector. And what you want is an interoperable common core so that, let's say, a European automotive manufacturer, pick one, Mercedes-Benz, not that I'm trying to pick a favorite, but a lot of leather seats in Mercedes cars, right? And one of the concerns Mercedes will have is, well, what's the carbon footprint of that leather? Now, if they try to reach back to the farmer, it will be impossible, really, because there's no commercial relationship that reaches that far. Even when you get to the leather, as far as a farmer's concerned, leather is a byproduct. They don't grow the cows in order to put nice seats in cars. They grow the cows for food, right? Their customer is McDonald's, not Mercedes. And so you need a model where the farmer is incentivized to produce a digital livestock passport for their customer, who's McDonald's, but in such a way that if Mercedes can find it through that linked data trail I spoke about, even though it was not produced for Mercedes and the farmer wasn't even thinking about Mercedes when they made that passport, the fact is Mercedes can still find it, and they can ignore the bovine characteristics. How big was the cow? What was the fat content? They can ignore the health treatments, and they can just say, use the number, which is the carbon intensity of this product, right? And that's the same across the board. And so that's basically the one answer to your question. There is a more complex answer or a more complex problem, because that's just kind of technical interoperability. Then the next problem is, and this one is quite a thorny one to solve, is that never mind the shape of the carrier, right? The digital product passport or digital livestock passport or whatever. The information it has in it is declarations about sustainability. This is my carbon footprint. This is my environmental footprint. This is my water usage, et cetera, right? And the rule base which you use to state those declarations, right, are different. There's hundreds or thousands of them, right? Because there are some common global ones, like the Pathfinder framework from World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which itself is based on the GHG protocol. But as soon as you look into a particular industry sector, you find you need to answer questions that go beyond what is in these generic standards. So what are the boundaries for carbon footprint assessment for lithium mining, for example, or for cattle? Very different rule sets. How you calculate the carbon intensity of a cow versus the carbon intensity of a shipment of copper concentrate. Obviously, they both have the same number, which is how much carbon per ton is in this shipment. But the way you calculate it, enormously different. And different across different industries and different geography sectors. And the rules are not just defined by governments and well-established standards bodies. They're defined by hundreds or thousands of industry associations, right? So if you look at standardsmap.org, it's an interesting site. It's run by a different UN body again, called the ITC. They've cataloged, I think it's a bit under 400 standards. And these are sustainability standards about ways to measure social impact or deforestation or whatever it is across the world, but generally in the textile and agriculture sector. Right? If you look at it, you'll find a lot of things missing if you talk about mining. There's also a lot of national regulations missing. In other words, 350 standards is actually only a small part of the global soup of standards, right? So by the time you add other commodities like mining and batteries and so on and so forth, and then you add the national regulations, right? So Australia has a whole rule set about how you calculate carbon emissions. It's called the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting Scheme. So does the US, so does Europe. They're similar, but they're not the same. And so now you've got this kind of nightmarish footprint, if you like. If you're a producer of product in a country and you want to export to another country, you've got your national rules, you've got your industry rules, you've got the rules of the importing country, and it becomes quite a complex problem of understanding how do I comply with all these rules. And one risk is that you have to redo your compliance against each rule set separately. And what that means is you're hiring an auditor, or you're filling in checklists or again and again and again and again. And there will be for sure a lot of overlap between these rule sets, right? Because they address the same purpose. So one of the bigger challenges for UNTP, and we're only beginning to scratch our heads about this one, is how to make rules comparable, right? So that if I've ticked a load of checkboxes in Rwanda, for example, and there's some, whether they're industry rules or government rules, those rules can be compared to the import market rules and say, yes, because you checked, or because you can prove that you've met these, let's say, 27 regulations and compliance rules in Rwanda, that means you've met 80% of the rules in this other country. So you only need to do the other 20%. This is a thorny problem that is not easy to solve and probably needs some sort of mutual recognition between the rules bodies. So UNTP won't solve that. It might only provide a recognition of the problem and a tool set about how to do mutual recognition. So the UNTP isn't going to say that this rule is the same as that rule, or that standards body or regulator should accept that criteria. It can't. We don't have the authority to do that, right? All we can do is make it visible and try to drive behavior towards mutual recognition. Because if you can't do that, the risk is that all this premium that we spoke about earlier, the increased value of sustainable goods, it all gets eaten up by ticking checkboxes, right? And paying for compliance instead of actually changing your production behavior, right? And so, it's got to keep the cost down, basically. And too many rules means too many costs. And so, mutual recognition, I think, is a way forward.
And how does the sustainability vocabulary catalog work?
Well, that is for that purpose, right? The idea is that we should be able to index rule sets that are not made by us, right? Made by ISO or made by GHG protocol or whatever. And provide a mechanism to assess a particular set of claims against a rule set. So let's say a passport has 15 conformity claims in it, and it references a bunch of rules. We should be able to algorithmically say, okay, you've made 15 claims and you've referenced 3 sets of regulation. We know the full scope of that regulation. Your claims cover 80% of that regulation, right? So that's a fairly easy assessment to make, because you're mapping the claim directly to the regulation or standard upon which it's based. But then the more challenging bit is, okay, we've also got an index or a digital view of the regulation in another economy or a different standard. Now we're trying to make some assessment of the similarity between rules, and that's much harder. We're going to do some experiments on that, and maybe show the way by example, right? And try to provide tools that an importing market can use to facilitate imports by saying, we recognize, this export market criteria. So it's early days with this. We know it's a problem, and we've got some emerging ideas about how to solve the problem. But at some point, you reach a case where only the organization that governs the rules has the authority to say, I recognize as equivalent some other organization's rules, right? We can't say that for them. We only need to provide the tools and visibility so that someone might be able to more confidently make that assertion. So that's the harder bit of UNTP, and that's what the sustainability vocabulary catalog will begin to address. But it's the last cab in the rank because it's the hardest one to do, I would say, and we'll be testing early ideas.
Yeah, but how are new data elements and standards proposed? How are they evaluated on UNTP? The more you get them, the
UNTP itself doesn't have very many data elements in the core vocabulary, right? And it builds on existing vocabularies from around the world, including some from GS1, the guys behind the barcodes, some from schema.org, and some from UN itself. The vocabularies of the claims, so the language of claiming, these are the things that are the rule sets in different regulations and standards around the world. And so we're not inventing that vocabulary. We're just reflecting that vocabulary. So it's not for us to say you can or cannot make this claim. Aside from all that, there is, like any standards development effort, all UN CFAC standards are developed using something called the open development process, where anyone, yourself, if you wanted to, could contribute to the effort by registering on the UN CFAC site as an expert, and an email will go off to your country head of delegation, saying that this person wants to contribute as an expert to UN standards efforts. And usually that gets approved, and then you're welcome to join the effort. It's a volunteer, unpaid effort. So you need a little bit of, selfless motivation for these things sometimes. But yeah, anyone can participate. And as you've seen, the ongoing effort is very public, right? There's a Slack channel, there's a GitHub site, all the conversations are made in the public. There's nothing happening behind closed doors. So anyone can watch what's going on just by looking at what's going on the GitHub site and the Slack channel. But if you actually want to contribute, then there's a process. So it's a very, very open framework.
Our listeners has been requesting to really talk about two key principles that everyone in the field, in the ecosystem, should try to address. And the first one is interoperability.
Yep.
And data exchange. I'll let you talk a little bit about interoperability, and I'll come back with the data exchange part, because there is a way we define it here, and we want to really understand how we can incentivize people to actually share data, and also the levels of disclosure. How do we make data sovereign? How do we empower countries to actually own the data? But actually own the data that matters. All of that discussion around data sharing has been really, really hard to make among industry key players.
Yes. Well, that's true. And again, there's a few answers to this, right, or a few questions there. Because one is, how do you do this technically, right? Well, you define some simple data vocabularies, which we're doing, but you also address some of the, let's call them technical scalability barriers. And one of them is, if you think about it, when sustainability information is increasingly attached to a high volume of low value products, as opposed to a low volume of high value products, it has to be automated, right? Otherwise the costs will blow out of all recognition. Right. So if you're buying a t-shirt or a pair of pants for $20-$30, you can't spend $20-$30 manually creating a digital product passport, can you? Right. So it has to be down to the cents, or less than that. It just has to be arbitrarily close to zero, which means it has to be automated and integrated. And that's the interoperability challenge, right? And one of the challenges in long value chains is how to share data between that start in one business system and end up in another IT system, but without depending on those IT systems talking to each other directly, right? Because if you have to have some sort of project to get I'm a big brand and I know I've got a supplier and we can't share digital data until our two IT systems talk to each other, and then we'll be waiting a long time, right? And so what UNTP says is, no, don't try to connect your systems. Instead, publish a little digital data packet, let's call it a digital product passport, with an embedded human rendering so that it doesn't matter whether a machine is reading it or a human is reading it. The same data package is consumable, and make it discoverable from the identifier of the thing. So but if you've got a thing with a barcode on it, basically, whether you're a machine looking at it or a human looking at it, shouldn't matter. And you should be able to get the data knowing only the signpost identifier. Just the barcode of the thing gives me a way to get the full data about the thing. If you can architect it that way, it means that every actor in the value chain can choose to go digital without any dependency on their upstream and downstream suppliers also being digital at the same time, right? You just issue digital product passports, and just like the passport in your pocket that you use to travel between nations, right? It's got most countries now have a chip, right? You swipe that passport at a smart gate and it reads it digitally. You show the same passport at the hotel desk and the human looks at it, right? It's the same model for a digital product passport. It should be digitally readable and human readable at the same time, so that the issuer can just choose to start spreading that. So that's the technical interoperability side of it, to make it simple to scale. But on top of that, another thing you touched on is the business incentives, right? You can make it as cheap and simple as possible, and that reduces the cost. But even if the cost is close to zero, but not quite zero, there will be no incentive unless there's a value side of the equation that exceeds the cost, right? And so a really important part of UNTP is some stuff that is nothing to do with technology and all to do with making positive business cases for implementation, right? So a part that we're aiming to come up with some business case templates that say, here's all the categories of benefit. Now, not all these categories might apply to every person or every actor, but you can use this sort of pre-calculated set of benefits and just put some weighting. 0 for this one doesn't matter to me. 1 for this one matters to me. And you get basically a business case out of a box, right? So that your cost and benefits are quick to assess, because every sustainability officer in every company has to make a case for investment to his boss, right, or her boss. And so this business case template is a tool to do that. The other thing we notice is that economies of both the benefits go up and the costs go down when you implement as a community as opposed to an individual. And the reason is, of course, you've got more digital data exchange when you implement as a community. But also you tend to find that the software systems needed to do this, there's a common pattern where in most countries, what you find is that you might have, let's say in Australia, for example, I can't remember the number, there's about maybe 30,000 farmers. But there's only about 6 or 7 on-farm software systems, right? So those 30,000 farmers are choosing one of 6 or 7. So if those 6 or 7 software vendors implement UNTP, then UNTP is available to 30,000 farmers, right? So by working at a community level, we reduce the costs by implementing once for many, and we increase the value by increasing the value of the data, but also bringing in organizations like regional development banks, right? So actually, the European Regional Development Bank has some footprint in Africa, and has a incentive to make green loans, right? And green trade finance and so on. So at the community level, we bring together the industry associations, the software technology providers, the regional development banks, etc., to take that individual business case and turn it into a community business case that uplifts the value and reduce the cost for every individual in the community, right? So that's all we can do, basically, because at the end of the day, UNTP is a voluntary standard, not a legal mandate. And so its uptake will depend on making a compelling business value story, right? So
does UNTP certify that a specific supply chain platform is UNTP compliant? Is there such a certification on the...
Yeah, so what UNTP will publish is a conformity test suite, right? So that whether it's like your friend Nathan's MindSpider platform or anyone of hundreds or thousands of these platforms, including business systems like SAP or Oracle or whatever, can read the specification, can do their implementation, and can do a self-assessment against a published test suite, and that test services will issue provide sort of evidence that will be provided when they register their implementation, right? So UNTP also has a framework that actually just this week will get published for implementers, potential implementers, and actual implementers to register their intent, right? So software companies or supply chain actors or certifiers or even governments can read the UNTP materials and say, all right, yes, we agree this is important and we commit to implement. And then when they've done their implementation, there will be tools to test. And at the moment, it's a self-assessment. So there's no third-party auditor saying, yes, your implementation is certified. That may come. It's another cost, right? And you avoid costs if you can. But it may come if, and the trigger for it would be if the pilots and the next round of pilots are designed in such a way that implementers read the spec, run the tests, and test. If we find that, oh no, it's just not rigorous enough and the interoperability isn't working, we may need a more rigorous threshold for claiming conformity. And that may impose some sort of, like you said, conformity assessment and certification. We don't know yet whether it'll be necessary.
Can you tell us a little bit about if you have a successful use case already that you've run with UNTP?
Yeah, so like I said before, it's very early days. But one of the early use cases was for Australian beef exports to Europe, because there is a piece of legislation in Europe called the EUDR, European Union Deforestation Regulation, right? And basically what EUDR says is that the EU will block market access. So actually, it's quite serious, right? Doors closed. For a whole series of products, including many foodstuffs like beef and other meats, plus soya beans and grains, and also wood and timber and so on. Anything that has an impact on land use, right? It will be blocked from the European market if during the entire value chain history, the product touched any property that has been deforested, and that means native forest removed, since 2020. So 2020 is the benchmark, and the act goes into force in 2024, December, in a few months. And so the European Union's running all kinds of satellite aggregators and data, and they'll do a risk-based assessment of a product. But again, it's the interesting feature is that the burden of proof is reversed. It's under the same due diligence regulation of other European acts. And so it's up to the importer in Europe to satisfy themselves to the level of legal due diligence requirements that the product meets the deforestation requirements, right? So how do you do that? You depend on your suppliers to give you a high integrity evidence, right? So although only about 4% of Australian cattle gets exported to, or meat gets exported to Europe, the Australian government decided to use UNTP as a prototype for this thing I mentioned earlier called AATP, where the test was, can we get farming systems to issue digital livestock passports with attached evidence from an accredited deforestation assessment done by satellite surveys and on the ground assessments, put the two together and make them available to the importer in a foreign country such that it meets the due diligence requirements of EUDR. So that was the purpose of a pilot that ran a few months ago. And I'd say it got a tick, and there is a plan underway to roll out the protocol to basically all Australian farms that export to Europe. So that's a fairly successful pilot. There are new ones about to start for mining, where the project lead for that is a Canadian lady who works for the British Columbia government. And so it'll probably start with Canadian mines. But it's a similar story, right? To provide evidence of compliance to various criteria from the upstream supply chain. Would really like to do one, actually, maybe even with data stake for critical minerals from Africa. At the moment, I would say that's gone as far as an acknowledgement that that's a good thing to do, an intent to do it, but not really got the right partners together yet. We need to engage with the government authorities and the right tool providers and so on to run that pilot, but it's on the agenda to do so, and hopefully prove that you can get just as good, reliable evidence from developing nations as you can from developed nations, because that's important for market access, right? To maintain market access.
Finally, what is on the roadmap of UNTP now? What should we expect as the next big thing, and how do you measure the effectiveness of the protocol?
Okay, so that's So like I said before, it's still under development, right? By the end of September, I hope to have version 0.5 ready for the next version of pilots, which will include critical mineral pilots, to further test the protocol so that we can release version 1.0 early next calendar year, right? January, February or something, next calendar year. So that's the kind of technical roadmap. Then it's an excellent question about how do you measure the impact, right? And one of the reasons actually to have a conformity testing framework and a registration of intent and actual implementation is so that you know who is implemented, and you can ask those people for anonymized reports, right? Because we put a fairly, I'll admit it's a fairly arbitrary goal, but you have to have a goal, right, to work towards. And our goal is that by 2030, we'd like to see 1 million UNTP digital product passports issued every day, right? So to be able to track progress towards that goal, we need implementers to register. So let's say MindSpider or others say, yes, we're going to implement. And then as part of their commitment, we will ask them to give us anonymized abstract level KPI data, like how many digital passports did you issue, right? You don't have to say to who and where and any sensitive details. Just give me the numbers. So that over the subsequent years, we hope to be able to report on uptake and impact.
Where can we find more about you and UNTP?
The best place would be the GitHub site, which is at uncfact.github.io/spec SPEC-UNTP or just Google. Yeah, the top link on Google is the GitHub pages. So just Google United Nations Transparency Protocol, and there you go.
And any specific way the audience could contribute to the efforts of UNTP?
Well, it depends what the audience role is, right? So if you're a software provider, then have a look at the technical specifications and ideally register your intent to implement. And there is a process to do that will be published actually probably tomorrow under the implementation pages on that site. If you're a supply chain actor, like a mining company, then you can also register your intent. You probably depend on some software package having already implemented to use it, or build your own, either way. If you're a certifying body that wants to issue digital conformity credentials, then you can also register that intent. If you're a regulator, you may want to consider issuing your permits and licenses and so on as digital conformity credentials so that they uplift the integrity of your products in export markets. And so, yeah, there's something in it for everyone. And there is a different purpose, I suppose, for each each role type. So anyone that's listening that is one of those roles may like to consider UNTP implementation, registering that commitment. There's no sort of legal, just because you register a commitment doesn't mean, you're going to get hauled over the coals if you don't. But we'd be very interested to hear from organizations, whether they're technology providers or supply chain industry actors or certification bodies or government regulators, whether they're interested in becoming a part of the global, transparent, and traceable ecosystem. So just click on the register here button, which will appear in the next few days.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, Steve. It was an honor to host you here.
Thank you for the good questions.
Thank you all for listening. If you like what you heard, give us a review and let us know what you'd like to hear about our future shows and help other people find us. If you want to join the conversation, please find us on social media, Traceability Inside the Podcast, and send us a message.